In this module, we'll discuss animations. First, a word of caution. Don't overdo it. Animations aren't about making things flashy or good looking. When you read Apple's or Google's documentation on animations, they are always explained. The first animation type exists to draw attention to something. A good example is when we enter a new form and want the user to notice a specific important feature. We can animate it. If we have more than one animation going on, the user will be distracted and will miss out on our highlight. An example for this is an animation on an important button, so the user will notice it. The second common use case is confirmation. One example of this is a form transition. In iOS, forms move from right to left when we dig deeper into the app. When we go back, they move in the opposite direction, thus confirming that we are going back. We also have a cover transition that is used to signify global functionality that resides outside of the navigation stack. But this sort of animation is important in many such cases. Elements animate outside when we delete them, so we will get a sense of confirmation that deletion did occur. We have a lot of animation types that allow you to deliver these use cases, as well as many frivolous effects if you so desire. We'll start with transitions. These are pretty much the first animation types people notice when running an app. Here I'll demonstrate transitions on a form, but we can apply a transition to a dialog or an arbitrary component by using the container.replace method. Using transitions is trivial. We just apply them to a form, a dialog, or use them in replace. The rest just works. We have several built-in transitions. Common transitions include things such as slide, cover, fade, etc. Flip transition is a card-like 3D effect that relies on device-native perspective transform. It will look pretty different on devices and the simulator. Morph converts one component to another and is aimed at the material design paradigm where a UI element in one form transforms to another when moving to a new form. Bubble transition is also inspired by material design and represents a dialog growing into place using a bubbling effect. For the most part, we use common transition for almost all transitions. I mentioned slide, fade, cover, etc. Slide is the default transition codename 1, except for iOS where the transition is slide fade by default. This is a special case transition that slides the body while fading and sliding the title elements at a different pace. The theme has common constants to define the default transition to the various types of elements. So you can define the default transition for form, dialog, etc. directly from the theme without changing the code. When we apply a transition to a form, we have both an in and out transition. This is often confusing. For dialogues, the transition in is what we show when the dialogue is shown, and the transition out is played when the dialogue is disposed, so we usually need both. For forms, we usually only use transition out by convention. There are some edge cases where both would make sense, but they are pretty rare, and unless you build your own custom transition, you will probably never need transition in on form. These are the uncover and cover transitions running on the cart action. When I picked this transition, I mostly tried to be consistent with other apps, but in retrospect, using cover for this feature makes perfect sense, as it's outside of the regular navigation stack. I use the morph transition to move from a thumbnail to the full screen image. The effect has its kinks, but it works. Exiting from the morph isn't as attractive, so I chose to use the uncover in the reverse direction. Going into the code, we can see the show checkout method, which shows how the transition is applied to the form. Notice we apply both cover and uncover respectively, so the effect of going in and going out of the form remains. Another important thing to notice is that we save the old transition out of the parent form. The reason for this is that we'd like to restore the old transition when we go out, so cover won't be used for all future navigation. This is restored here when we press the X button. That's handled in the constructor of the checkout form. The dish effect is a bit more nuanced. Morph transition works by converting one component to another component. In this case, we convert the thumb component, matching the dish ID, to the background image. Notice that these map to the name properties of the respective components. The reason for this is that a transition can be defined and cloned before a form exists or while a form changes. By binding to a component name, we effectively disconnect the transition from a specific component instance. Notice that every thumb also has the ID appended to it. This allows us to distinguish between different entries within the form. We use the show listener to restore the original transition out. Since a new form instance of dish view form is created every time, this shouldn't be a problem. If this wasn't the case, we would have needed a remove show listener too.